Okay, well here we are now with our next two processes in project risk management, qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. So let's look at these. Project risk, let's review these first because it'll help us. Project risk is an uncertain event that impacts our triple constraint and possibly the quality of our products. They can be positive or they can be negative. Known risks that we have identified now in our risk register are known risks. We don't know when they'll occur, if they'll ever occur, but they are known unknowns. So known, they're in our stakeholder risk register. They're unknown because we don't know if it's going to happen. But if they do, we will have put aside a contingency reserve in our project budget to compensate for the time and effort it takes to recover from those risks should they happen. But we'll have a plan for it. We won't be running around like a chicken with our head cut off. We'll know what to do because we'll have a response plan, which in a couple of processes will actually create the response plans. And we also have the unknown risks that we did not either think about or we were naive enough to think, well, I don't even want to write that down. But if it happens, then we're in trouble because we don't have a response plan. That's why we have a management reserve, which is this funding up here we hope stays there that we can draw upon and then make part of our budget because we're using it to compensate for these unknown unknowns. Again, project attitudes, risk appetite, how much uncertainty am I willing to take because I want this reward, and if I'm riskier, I may get that reward more than if I'm not. Tolerance, I'll take risk, I see risk, it's happening, okay, but now all of a sudden I'm not okay with it, that's your threshold. Now here's our knowledge area overview for risk management. What I've done here is just to try and emphasize a few things and reinforce a couple of things. We already talked about planning our risk up here and identifying up here. Now we're in 11.3 process, okay, performing the risk analysis, qualitative risk analysis, qualitative, and here's where we actually get into our probability and impact matrix that we talked about earlier. And down here in the next process we'll talk about in this module 2 is 11.4 quantitative, and quantity means like money and things. So two different ways of viewing and categorizing and assessing risk and putting values to them. And the output down here of qualitative is project documents updates. And as we'll see, what those are primarily is your risk register and the assumptions log. Now we've talked about assumptions a number of times so far, but assumptions have to be managed, and they have to be managed somewhere. So the most appropriate place to do this is within risk management because assumptions have elements of risk. PMBOK says you can either keep it as a separate risk log and manage it separately, or you can use it as a part of the risk register, and it's your option. I would seriously recommend you keep it within the risk register family and manage your assumption log with your risk register. So that would be your outputs. Notice project doc and the risk register is an input to plan risks. So now that you have your qualitative probabilities, now you need to put plans against those to mitigate them and take care of them should they happen. And they also go over here into quantitative for the same reason. So down here, your outputs down here from quantitative are the same thing, project documents, risk register, assumption log, and they're both inputs to plan risk. So that's how this works. And by the way, the risk management plan, risk register comes up here, risk register. So it's this circular, interactive, okay, integrated kind of processes that PMBOK is all about. So a little bit more of the dynamics here of how these things work. So here's the actual data flow diagram for performing qualitative. And again, the scope baseline comes in when we have it because scope baseline is very critical to manage a lot of risk in scope. That's exactly what you're trying to build. You don't want that to be jeopardized, and you want to manage it and protect it with your risk response plans where appropriate. Of course, your risk management plan comes in here. That's your guiding, how do I do this? How do I effectively, perform these? They'll give you guidelines on how to perform a qualitative analysis. And of course, the main thing is your risk register. That is that's the main ingredient that you're going to perform the qualitative analysis upon. And then the outputs are project documents, which are your risk register updated with your assumptions log. So here we are. Here's our ETO diagram. Output against the project documents, the risk register, and the assumption log. Inputs further. The risk management plan, that's who's responsible for it, what the roles are and responsibilities for managing risks on your project. And if you can dedicate somebody or have somebody have a prime focus, at least a watchdog risk all the time on your project, you're in a good space because you need somebody to pay attention to this. And you as project manager, can only slice your time so much. So either you do it on a smaller project or on a larger one, have somebody do it under your guidance. The scope baseline again, is a key component. Common risks to projects are in there. High-risk, state-of-the-art project would have many more risks than just a low-risk, run-of-the-mill kind of project in that kind of regard. The risk register, it has your risk assessments. You prioritize your risks in the risk register, so you pay attention to the most critical ones more than the lower ones, especially the ones that are on a watch list that we'll see. Environmental factors, risk assessment insights. Whatever you can glean from other human resources, from other external environments, you need to do as best you can to get information to help you identify and plan your risk. And now we're talking about qualitative risk. How do they do it there? Can you do it yourself? Sure you can. Similar prior projects, see what they did. Always see if your organization is savvy enough and mature enough to actually have these process assets available, you do want to use them, see what they have, see what they've done. Okay, so here's our tools and techniques of how we're going to perform qualitative risk analysis. The risk probability and impact assessment, point 1, and the probability and impact matrix, point 2, we'll look at together here. We're going to end up prioritizing on probability and impact for any risk, particular risk, and you may get risk rating rules from your organizational process assets. But here's what this would look like. Earlier, we saw this little diagram here. I may have called this the probability and impact matrix. It is not itself. This is the impact assessment guide from your company, or you may make it up. And again, what this said was, for these project elements, if it's very low, moderate, or high, if a risk occurs, these are the impacts that it has. So it's the impact portion of the probability and impact matrix. Down here is the actual probability and impact matrix, where the impact scores or ratings here are down here on the bottom, and they're here twice. They're here very low to high for threats, and they're down here very low to high this way, low to very high for opportunities. And how this works is, for any particular threat in your risk register, you would say, if this threat were to occur at one of these probabilities, if it's 90% probable that this threat would occur, and it has a very high impact on us, then you would have a score of 0.72, which would be 0.9 times 0.8, 0.72. And likewise, this is just a mathematical calculation of the numbers on the impact numbers and the probability. And you would assign this number to your risks, and then you can sort them by that product total, the product of it, that number, and you would help manage them in order of priority by the most severe possibilities of risks or to the lowest. And likewise with opportunities, except you would want the higher product, 0.72s to actually happen for opportunities, and the 0.72s for threats. You really want to make a plan to avoid those or mitigate them in some way. So that's how this would work. You use these numbers to sort your risk register. Risk data quality assessment. This is the degree to which the risks that you understand what they really are. They may be viable, but you still may not totally understand what they are. And you have to have good accuracy, quality, reliability, integrity in the assumptions you make with these risks. So risk data quality assessment. Categorize the risk by the source. Again, we're getting down to perhaps even root causes here. Well, it's root causes. Areas of your project that could be affected by this. And then, you always want to try and manage by the root cause if you can, because that'll take care of a lot of risks that are spawned by that root cause. Urgency assessment. Near-term risks, have more priority than the risk that may happen later on in the project because of what you're doing with the project. You may generate more risk later than right now, but the ones right now are called near-term risks. And you combine that with your risk rating, that product of the impact and the probability, and you come up with a final risk severity rating, and the highest ones are the ones you want to pay most attention to today. Tomorrow, next week, next month, those rankings may change, because if something's a severe risk now at this point in the project and you completed something on the project, say, so it's no longer a risk for that piece, then it goes away, and then something else now is your top one. So these things are dynamic, they change. Expert judgment, of course, always call on expert judgment all the time. Don't be embarrassed ever to call on expert judgment. It makes you a better person. It makes the expert you call on more trustworthy with you. They'll enjoy helping you, and you'll both grow in that partnership, and it'll be a big advantage to you over time. So expert judgment, they'll help you assess the impact and probability of each risk, expert judgment, and then where to put it in the matrix so that you can come up with your prioritized list. Tool and technique. And we're going to come back in a minute and talk about the outputs of qualitative risk analysis. Okay, now that we've talked about qualitative risk analysis, which is the probability of a risk occurring, the impact of that risk should it occur. You come up with a product and you apply certain other metrics to it so that you can come up with a ranked list of risks by the highest impact ones, the ones with the most exposure first. You want to manage those. So the output of this whole process is what here they generically call project document updates. And as we saw when we talked about the data flow diagram a little earlier in those things, obviously it's the only output, but again, it's masked what the real outputs are, which are your risk register updates and your assumption log. So the risk register, you will update it now with your probability impact assessment for each risk. You'll put the risk rating on there. The urgency of the risk you can use by sorting them by their score, their risk score. You can categorize them. You don't have to have just one long list from 90 down to 1. You can have several lists doing that where you categorize your risks, like risks to building this deliverable, risk to a certain stakeholder, for example, risk with our supplier. You can categorize them however you want and split them up that way to make them more manageable. But it's the same concept. You do your probability impact risk scores, categorize them, or sort them and manage them in that way. Now here's the first time we officially see this low risk watch list. But those are risks that you don't really, it doesn't make much sense right now perhaps to do this effort of probability impact. You know they're risks, you just don't think they're necessary to deal with right now, but you put them on a watch list so you don't lose track of them. And there could be many, many of these, and you need to review these, maybe not as much as your real risk register, but you still need to review them. And it may become a point where you can just like drop them off, or you may need to promote them into your risk register and apply your probability and impact scores to them. Risk register updates, risk response plans would be in there too. Now we haven't done those yet. We're going to do those pretty soon, but they would be also part of your risk register. And it's interesting to know, I put in parenthesis because they don't say that in the PMBOK here, but as you read the PMBOK in detail, you'll find that this is actually the case. The risk register itself also, well, let me rephrase that. The risk register itself, in addition to having your response plans and how you would respond to a threat or an opportunity if it were to occur, if it were to occur and you executed that plan, or if it was an unknown and a risk occurred and you pulled some management funds and you recovered from the risk, whatever you actually did to respond to it is an official part of the risk register. That is where it goes. You need to document your actual activities and to respond to risk somewhere, and it is in the risk register, not in the risk register itself as an appendix. You would keep an appendix of all your risk responses that you actually activated and responded to and finally closed. So that's where that would go. That's why it's in parentheses, because they don't actually say that in so many words, but that's where it goes. The assumptions log, again, any assumptions are risky, as we said, and you do want to manage them as a companion with the risk register, a good place to go along with your activated response plans. So that's where they go. So you want to update your assumptions. Some assumptions will become real risks. Some assumptions may become real things and they go away, but you still need to manage them, and here's where you do it. We're going to come back then and talk about quantitative risk analysis, another slant on how you manage your risks in a minute. Okay, now we're moving on to process 11.4 in risk management, which is quantitative risk analysis. We're talking more now about money rather than aggregate probabilities of risks occurring and their impact. Now we're going to try and put some dollars to things, and there are some methods that are available to do that should your project be such that these are of value to you. So 11.4 here in our overview. Here's our data flow. Now what's going on here? Of course, our risk management plan comes in. Of course, our risk register, we need that, primary input. Our schedule management plan comes in because we'd like to know how this impacts that too. Cost, the same. And outputs, again, our project documents, which are the risk register and so on, like we saw before. So now this is, according to PMBOK, and most likely in a project anyway, these are optional. These are optional numerical analyses of your prioritized risks, which if this provides benefit to you in your project, you would then want to do this. But again, even PMBOK says this is optional. So they certainly do recommend that you do your qualitative probability impact assessment so you can come up with your prioritized risks on your risk register that you need to look at constantly. But this is another tool that you could use to help manage your risk from a monetary point of view. So this helps support decisions to reduce project uncertainty, and it aggregates a lot of the risks of all your project objectives. Again, project documents that are output are your risk register and assumptions log. Here's the inputs. Your management plans, these three, risk, cost, and schedule, come in. Risk, because you have your quantitative analysis in there, you need to know what those are because you use those as inputs to this process. Your cost and schedule, they have your management reserves, your contingency and management reserves actually, which are money, and those enter into this mix also as well. Risk register comes in. Why? Well, that is your reference point that you're going to use for these quantitative analysis. Environmental factors, again, past project insights, industry risk studies on how they do quantitative analysis and so on. Organizational process assets, again, your own internal project insights. So the tool and technique, this is called data gathering and representation techniques. You want to be able to represent how monetary values are affected by these risks. You can interview knowledgeable people, your experts, your stakeholders, whoever you need to get information, and historical data too. And you apply the data gathered to these appropriate models. It's very difficult to be specific here in this discussion of exactly what you would do on your project for these, how you would use this stuff, but let's just look at the fundamental exercise and capabilities of these things, and you need to use them to your advantage in your own organization. We're going to talk a lot about ranges of things here, and in particular, low, most likely, and high. And we're going to even talk about this in more detail when we get into cost management with low, most likely, and high kinds of probabilities. So you would have a WBS element over here, whatever you're talking about, and you say, well, what is it going to cost? You're going to ask expert judgment interviews, what's it going to cost to perform some function? And they'll say, well, it may cost as little as $4 million. But boy, it could probably even cost $10 million. We're really not sure, right? Because we're doing risk, we're not sure assumptions. But most likely it'll be $6 million here, and so on. So you have your low, most likely, and high. And you can plot these in what's called continuous diagram here. Probability distributions, uniform distributions, that is. No obvious value more likely than between high and low. No obvious, it's just low, medium, and most likely. And you plot those, you get there's two different ways of plotting these, and they have formulas against them. And we're not actually going to talk about the formulas, just the concept right here. We'll actually talk about the formulas in a later knowledge area. But there are these things called, and you need to know these either way. There's a beta distribution, which is a smoother curve between your low, high, and most likely value, and something called triangular, like this. And it's all based on the formula itself. It's a very simple formula, but we'll see that later on. But you can apply your information to those and read the PMBOK, and again, more detail when we get into cost. But what these will do is help you assess the impact in a monetary way of your high priority risks. Analysis and modeling techniques, which all apply to these things, called sensitivity analysis for money issues, exposure, based on high risk occurring with this high, most likely, low range kind of thing. And it's something called a tornado diagram. Again, it's lexicon, PMI lexicon, tornado diagram. You need to know what that is. And it looks like this. Looks like a tornado, right? And it shows by sensitivity of a risk occurring this graph here. See, the gray here is negative impact over on the left. The dark is positive impact over here. So risk number one could have a range of monetary impact down here as you translate those other formulas onto this graph, as an example, of way between, almost, 10,000 all the way, a loss of 10,000, all the way up to a positive gain of, $17,000, $18,000. And likewise, you rank them so that, the risk down here has a very low exposure to your money, either positively or negatively. So, you want to pay a lot of attention to this risk up here that it doesn't happen, or if it's an opportunity risk, you'd want it to happen up here. So it's a tool you have to help visualize the impact of your risks on a monetary basis to your project, which gets to EMV, okay, expected monetary value. Now, don't get this confused with later on, we're going to talk about EVM, earned value management, two different things. EVM, earned value, is used for forecasting. You're trending your costs and so on. This is a way of determining, given different possibilities and probabilities, what might the impact on the cost be to your project or against a risk or whatever. So the average outcome, EMV, is average outcome when future scenarios may or may not happen. It may happen, may not happen. What's the possible outcomes monetarily of that occurring? it is risk neutral assumption, meaning when you do this, you're not taking any kind of side. You're not skewing it that I'm risk adverse, or you're not skewing it that actually, boy, I'm risk seeking. Remember, they're risk seeking opportunities. I'll take risks if I get something in the end. These are neutral to that. You apply those, later on, but if you want, but these are risk neutral. And it's the sum of multiplying the possible outcomes by the probabilities of their occurrence. This is called, and there's a number of ways you can use to depict this. One of the most common one is a decision tree analysis. So let's look at this in a little more close up here. Decision tree. It starts with some kind of a scenario up front. And this example is like, do I build a plant or do I upgrade the plant? Okay, you need to make a decision. If I build the plant, I need to invest $120 million to build the plant. Let's say I just want to upgrade the plant, and I know that would cost me $50 million to upgrade the plant. Which is the better one to do? You don't know at this point. So now you go on further. Well, if I build a new plant, our company image with our customers say, oh, a new plant, better product, all this stuff, we'll have strong demand. We're going to estimate strong demand, and we're going to generate $200 million worth of revenue. But if we're wrong, and that doesn't really, well, our customer base, well, okay, so what? We may have a weaker demand of only $90 million for our product. And we think there's a 60% chance that we will have strong demand, a 40% chance that we'll have a weak demand. We don't like it, but those are our best guess estimates at this point, the probabilities of that occurring. So if we do have a strong demand, our net revenue, or the benefit to us, is the cost of our income, $200 million, minus the cost of getting that income, which is building the plant of $120 million, or we have a net benefit to us of $80 million. Okay, that sounds good. Now, but what if we have weak demand? Well, we've invested $120 million, we're only getting 90 back, we've lost $30 million in that period because of this. So what you do then, well, let's look down here. Same thing with the upgrade plant. You have the same kind of scenario. If we upgrade the plant, we think we'll have a strong demand of $120 million because it's still an older plant, but we upgrade it, but it'll give us this kind of income, we think. In fact, we think there'll be a 60% chance that we'll get this strong demand and this income. But, if we upgrade the plant, we still may have a weaker demand. This is all corporate assumptions now. It's nothing you can really be involved with. That's what they think. And there's a 40% chance that'll happen. So similarly, you calculate it out. And if they upgrade the plant and they do get strong demand, they'll net $40 million or $70 million. If they have weak demand, they'll only net 10, but at least they'll net something. As opposed to up here where they may have a loss because of the larger investment. So what you do here is now you work backwards. You say, okay, 120, or let's start here, 120 million, I'm sorry, $80 million is our possible, but it's 60%, right? Possibility of that. So actually you take that times 60, 80 times 60 is 0.48, which is down here, 80 times 60, 0.48, and you add that to the same thing down here, 30 times 40, or minus 30 times 40, which is minus 120 right there. So 48 minus 120 is 36. So 36 million with a scenario overall of building a new plant. You will assume to then, either way it happens, strong or weak, you're going to end up with a possibility of $36 million to you benefit. Now you do the same thing down here with the upgrade plant option. 70 million times 60 is 42, 10 times 40 is 10, 42, that's 46 million, do the calculations. So given this, which is the best option you would take? Well, you get a better bang for the buck down here in 46 million than you do with 36, so that would be what you possibly would recommend you do. The caveat here is, and management always has to make decisions based on their best estimate and the risk. This is risk tolerance, risk appetite right here. Am I willing to take the chance that I may lose $30 million in this plant to gain 36 or 46? There is no right answer here. It's up to your organization, but that's tools that they use to analyze the risks involved with doing these two things, and now they have some quantitative information to base whatever decision it is they're going to make. So we're going to talk about modeling and simulation then in a minute. Okay, we're ready to look at a few other tools and techniques for quantitative analysis. But first I want to just review something we just looked at. This was our decision tree that we looked at. We went through how you calculate what might be the best choice, well actually not the best choice, to give management options to make an informed decision rather. If you look up here in the upper right, I brought back in that table we saw earlier where we had the low, most likely, and high estimates. You know, these are just swags at best, perhaps. But I've covered up the elements because they would just confuse us. But for some, an element here might be building the plant and what kind of demand, weak or strong, would you get. So let's say that this one here was what kind of weak demand would we get for the option to upgrade a plant. Well, management says, well, low we might get, in this case, the numbers don't jive, but in this case, 4 million, maybe as high as 5, but the most likely is 6. So what you do is you take these numbers, you pump, and they would create a graph like we saw here, one of these beta or triangular distributions. Management would look at the graph and they say, well, ramps up, maybe this point here is where we would really think it may happen. Given all this information, they're making their best guess, best estimate. They would take that number and then put it down here. Okay, that's where they would basically get this number. Likewise, for the high estimate here, 200, if that were to say 200, they may decide, looking at the graph, say, no, we really think we're going to get good demand, so they make an informed decision, and they take a risk, right? Their risk appetite is risk-seeking, even though the probability here is lower than the most likely. We really think we're going to get that high demand, so we're going to put that number in here, and likewise. So let's say the second one was, how much is it going to cost to build the plant? Well, it'll be between 16 to 35, but our most likely is 20. They look at the graphs, they decide, okay, we think maybe it's really pretty good, so they're going to put the 20, which in this case is 120 million, put it in there. So that's how these two graphs would interrelate. They're just not independent things. They relate and support each other. So that's quantitative risk analysis in this regard. So now we can move on. And that was, by the way, again, expected monetary value, and that's the analysis that goes in it, along with your sensitivity analysis is what those other analyses were. So now modeling and simulation is yet another tool and technique when you're doing quantitative analysis, and by far the most popular one, if it's used, is called the Monte Carlo situation. And really you need automation for this. A computer you really got to have, because what this does, it does those high, medium, low, most likely scenarios, but it does it hundreds and hundreds of times. And it comes up with a curve based on all the possible combinations of high, low, most likely. It comes up with a curve like this. And here's the probability of things happening and then the cost. So now management can look at this graph and they can make yet another informed decision on where they would want to place money and put their stake in the sand, as it were, of a quantitative estimate of something. And of course you can use this for pure other risk analysis other than building a plant, of course. You know, is this probability risk going to occur? If so, what is our exposure monetarily? And you can use these same techniques to determine the cost monetary of either experiencing a negative risk. You know, I'm going to lose $14 million if this happens, that's our best guess, or we can gain, you know, $14 million if this opportunity materializes. So you can use it for both. This is just another tool and technique that they can use to do that. So when you're done with this, well, actually, then, of course, expert judgment is what drives all this, because the experts look at all this stuff, and they together come with their consensus and say, okay, let's put this number in our estimate model. And the output is, again, just like with quantitative, you have your risk register, but now you have cost and schedule probabilistic results, probability of achieving costs, like we saw with building the new plant or upgrading one. You could also use it for scheduling objectives. You can put time in there if you want, because time is money, right? Prioritized list now of quantified risks. You know, we want to achieve this opportunity, or, you know, watch out for this because it's going to cost us the most, we think, if it happens, that kind of thing. And trends, you can use that too. Now your assumptions log is also it, because what you do now is you may have even more assumptions. We're assuming that we're going to build this plant for 120 million. That's an assumption. Will it happen? You don't know for sure until you build it, and then it's too late, you know, if you're really wrong. Of course, along the way you can hopefully make adjustments. That's what project managers do, try to manage change. Okay, so that's it for qualitative and quantitative project risk analysis. It's not enough, although you might, and some project managers do, just list all their risks and try to manage them there. If you're a little more sophisticated, a little more into it, and you really want to gain a better intelligent control over the risk that you have and the importance and the magnitude of their impact, positive or negative, you're going to want to use one or both of these techniques as appropriate. So that's it for Module 15. Next one is Module 16, where we're going to then plan for the planning responses for these risks when they do occur. So we'll see you then.